Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rockbund Art Museum. My name is Joanie Zhu, and as the head of programs and research, I welcome you all to our artist and curator talk in the context of Rindon Johnson's exhibition titled Best Synthetic Answer. And let me begin briefly introducing Rindon, and also above all, thank you, Rindon, for this exhibition. Rindon is an artist and poet. He was born on the unceded territories of the Ohlone people, San Francisco, and currently lives between Berlin, Lenapehoking, New York. Rindon is a professor at the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Cultures at Harvard University. And his selected solo exhibition has been exhibited in Chisenhall Gallery in London, Sculpture Centers in New York, Julia Stoschek Collection in Düsseldorf, and also Rindon has participated in group exhibitions internationally. Currently, he's included in Foreigners Everywhere, the 60th Venice Biennale, and also Contamination in Kunsthaus Freiburg, and also Radical Reading Room at the Studio Museum in Harlem. He is the author of many books, including Nobody Sleeps Better Than White People, published in 2019. The VR book, Me in the Corner, Shade the King, and also Law of Large Numbers, Black Sonic Abyss, that is published in 2021. And let me also welcome Exdru Noel, the artistic director of the museum, and also the curator of the exhibition, who has been in conversation with Rindon for the past 2 years during the making of the exhibition. Over to you both.
Thank you everyone for coming, and it's such a pleasure to be able to open the show of a 2 years in the making, but I think for Rindon maybe is what they say a lifetime project, because I think each project of yours is a lifetime project. So I think it's such an honor for me and for all my team here today to introduce Rindon's practice. I think we had a bit discussion about how we want to approach this conversation today, and we landed on wanted to share a bit more of your practice at large, and then we'll dive deeper into the work and the exhibitions you see on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th and 7th floor of the museum. So maybe begin with your presentation.
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This exhibition, kind of has been somehow in my brain for most of my life, but I could never have done it anywhere else or in conversation with anyone else. So thank you so much, X, and thank you to the whole Rockbund team. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my practice generally, and then we'll discuss the show, like X was just saying. So can I just press the button? Is that okay? Hey. Hi. This is me at the Hogwarts place where they have all the sets outside of London. This was like a very special moment in my life because I got to ride a broomstick for the first time, and it's absolutely hilarious. And I felt I should share it with you before we go on this deep dive of talking about some things that are fun and some things that are not fun. So hi, this is me. So my first book, Nobody Sleeps Better Than White People, came out in 2016, and it's barely a book. It's more like a chapbook. I had studied photography at NYU for my undergraduate degree, and my frustrations with photography came about right in the middle of that process. I felt like there was more that I wanted to say that I couldn't put into a singular image or grouping of images. And over time, I started writing more and more, and it reached a point where that was kind of what I was doing most of the time, was writing a lot of poetry. And all my friends were poets. We were constantly writing about art in New York. And I ended up putting this book together, and it kind of became the thing that I did. I was reading poetry constantly, but I kind of began to miss making visual art. And so I started very intensely trying to figure out, like, could I do something more? And working on sculptural things that hinted at my slide-based photographic process that I had been working on in undergrad, and kind of expanded on that. And in this kind of chasm between poetry and sculpture, I kind of realized that they had a lot of similarities, and that actually, because when you read a poem aloud, you have to remember the thing that came before. You're doing a really similar thing with your brain as you do when you look at a sculpture, where you can't see the whole thing at once. So you have to hold part of it inside of your mind. So it becomes quasi-virtual, the same way that reading is. And so I thought, oh my God, they're the same thing. And in that realization, it kind of then opened up my practice for me, and has kind of led me down the path that I'm on now. So that was the first book. And my next book, with that thinking in mind, was actually a virtual reality poetry book called Meet in the Corner. And this book collaged a lot of early virtual reality footage that you could have found on YouTube, but also was something that I kind of created. I created multiple different cameras to try and remake this space that I created digitally in Blender. So it was basically a virtual room that I allowed people to be inside of, and the room, the walls shifted and everything around it changes. So this is kind of a little corner of the room where images are kind of constantly coming and going. So you could view that book through like a Google Cardboard, if we remember those. And I liked that it was kind of this more open thing that you could look at anywhere. This next book, Shade the King, was a collaboration with my friend Sarah Serpas. I read her the book, and then she created all of these drawings to go alongside of it. And at that point, I kind of was like, okay, I'm doing something crazy here. The book was all about trying to avoid naming. It was right before I came out as trans, and I have a very complex relationship, I think, with my own identity, like everybody does. And in particular, I, with this book, was wrestling with the fact that if I had my way, I wouldn't be called much of anything, right? But we need names, they're practical. We have to put some sort of definition towards ourselves and to other things in order to just stay in communication with one another. At the same time, it felt like every time I named something or some part of myself, I shut that thing down or I enclosed it. And so I kind of found myself confused about how do I not enclose while simultaneously still creating some sort of boundary around myself or my ideas. So this book was definitely just like wandering around those questions, which I'm honestly still doing. I finished graduate school and I was offered this show at the Stashek Collection, and this was the first time where I got to really show the breadth of all the things that I'm interested in. And so the main crux of the exhibition was basically around a series of stones that my wife's friend took from Zimbabwe in the 90s when he went to go study sculpture there. And so he basically, after he finished studying, put all of the stones inside of a shipping container, about like 18,000 tons of rock, put it inside of a shipping container, and then took it back to his grandmother's farm in Hanover. And when he took them there, he kind of realized that actually these stones were full of power and that he couldn't sell them to just anybody, and he couldn't honestly even work with them. So they just kind of stayed there. And he took his favorite ones and he dragged them to Berlin and he put them on his balcony, and they just sat there for many, many years. And when I heard about this, I was like, I wonder if he would give me some of them. We talked for weeks and weeks, me and this guy, Stefan. And he finally said, yeah, you can have some of these stones. I think you'll take good care of them. And I was like, okay, cool. And then we realized they've been in Germany for so long at that point that they were naturalized German citizens. And I was like, oh, these rocks are German citizens. That's fascinating. Like, what are we gonna do with them? And so I started wondering, okay, how do we employ them in this exhibition space? So what I ended up doing was stealing a bit from Hans Haacke, the very famous German artist who also had an exhibition in Dusseldorf about 30 years before mine, 40. And he basically took water from the Rhine and let it grow into an ecosystem. And I thought, maybe I will submerge these rocks and let them grow into an ecosystem. The rocks are serpentine, and serpentine in many cultures is all about serpents. It's all about renewal and things turning around and changing and coming together. And so submerging them in water and sort of the water's evaporation would, I hope, bring a kind of refresher or a loop bringer into the space. And so the show was all about looping, and this was the first of those works. This is when I started working really explicitly with live streams and closing circuits and the idea of watching and looking at duration in a way that was observation-based, but also kind of accepting the fact that we can't fully ever see something, this idea of unknowing and unable to define, kind of making that clear and on display temporally. Yeah, so here's some shots of those. So this is where the feed went out to, which was a large space inside the gallery. And the rest of the space had all sorts of different kind of plays around with leather and with virtual reality and other like digital forms. I started working with leather in graduate school because I was on this mission about finding a material that was very similar to my own identity. And I experimented with many different things, but what I finally realized was my identity was only a byproduct of the transatlantic slave trade. And because my identity was a byproduct, anything else that was a byproduct could also mirror then my identity. And so the cows came about, the leather rather, came about because leather is a byproduct of the cattle industry. And so I thought, I could attach myself to this byproduct and thus have my material. I'm a really big fan of art history. I love it. And I think I sometimes do things because another artist did it. And this particular move that I've done is I will use leather for the rest of my career because many artists commit themselves to one material for their entire practice. And so my one material is leather. So every time I have a show, there's always a piece of leather or hide or a cow somehow worked into the show because it's part of who I am in a way. So you can see these rawhide works, which had been, at this point, these rawhides had been like to 5 different countries and had been like submerged underwater for days and had like a really hard go. And so this was kind of their last outing, basically. I thought it was quite interesting working with leather that I didn't have so much control. I think so much about what is expected of an artist is to create something very thoroughly that is pitch perfect or well-tuned. And for me, it made me uncomfortable because there's nothing that I do that is not in conversation with somebody else or some other way of being. And why would I not also then be in conversation with my materials? And so the cows, the leather, it's always changing, just like everything is always changing. The slides came back and I started working with photographs again. This show was called Circumscribe, and so every single one of these slides is me trying to catch something in a circle and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding. Another circle. This piece was my first true virtual reality film. It's called Diana Said, and it's basically again, questioning control as I tried to figure out could I convince you that my hands were your own, right? So the hands that you see in this image are kind of changing constantly, and when you view it, you can't really figure out, am I controlling this, or is this just happening to me? And of course, that's a larger question that I have about being a person. It's am I controlling the things that are happening, or are they just happening to me? We're gonna skip that watching part. This is when the cows started to get pretending like they were paintings, and I kind of leaned into that, and the work on display here really thinks they're paintings. Let's see. Okay, and this now to kind of draw a circle is, among other things, which is on view on the 6th floor here, and it was a film that I made in conversation with other artists, but in particular because I wanted to describe why I was working with the cow, but also the poetics of working with an animal and the complications of working with animals and the fact that it makes me uncomfortable, but I won't be stopping, and this kind of confusion in that. So I don't know, I think maybe we stop in 2019 and then, or do you want to keep going? Should I keep going? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So more shots of Among Other Things. Among Other Things, because it was both found footage and footage of my own existence, dealt with a lot of the questions that I was having at that time. My parents' house burned down in the Bay Area when there were all those fires that happened in 2017. And I was thinking a lot about fire as a form of renewal, but also fire as kind of like a sign that things need to change. And sort of, it's a question in a way, like, do we take on signs or do we ignore them? And so I was playing around with those questions in the film. I have a lot of theories that I play out in my work, and in this piece, which is a virtual reality film, I was really interested in the idea that sometimes it feels like something will happen in a science fiction universe, and then a few years later, it will be happening to us in real life. And I thought, maybe we should take more control over that instead of making all these dystopian films. Rather, maybe we should start proposing things that would actually be kind of cool and kind of nice. And so I thought very flat-footedly and basically, maybe I could just end world hunger. What would that look like if we just had food that grew on trees, and in particular protein that grew on trees? And so I came up with this idea of these meat trees where there were these trees that grew meat, and then all you had to do was harvest them every now and then. But of course, in the complication of my own brain, I was but if it's growing meat, that means it probably has sentience. And so I constructed this reality where basically nobody has to work because all the food and water is taken care of, and only a very small group of people work, and they're called meat growers, and they harvest the meat. And there's these two lovers who work in the meat growing plant, and the trees have just made it clear through a bunch of different avenues that they're sentient and we are harvesting them incorrectly. And the two lovers are fighting about this through the whole film. One of them's who cares? We need to eat. This is what's causing peace on our planet. This is so cool. And the other one's no, we should listen to the trees. Even if there's a fallout for us as humans, we're hurting them. They've given us so much. We have to listen. And there's no conclusion. It's just a conversation. And then it ends. They harvest the meat and they go home. That's one of them. And there's the other one you can kind of see. So yeah, that was a film that I was making. And somewhere in there, I got invited to do a show at Chisenhale and at Sculpture Center. My father is in finance, and he's obsessed with talking about numbers all the time, my whole life. And the way that he talks about money is exactly the same way that my mother, who is an art dealer, talks about painting. It's two different forms of abstraction coming together over the dinner table all the time. And so with this show, I wanted to hone in on my dad's favorite phrase, which is the law of large numbers, which is basically at some point a company or an entity gets so big that there's nowhere else for it to go except for to start to devour itself, right? The numbers are so large they just begin to eat themselves. And recently, over the last 10 years or so, it's it feels once a month he's calling me and he's it's just the law of large numbers, something's gotta happen. And it's oh, because we're at a point where it's time to start devouring ourselves. And I was a bit oh, damn, Dad. So he named the show, actually. And that kind of set the tone for this book, which I wrote mostly during COVID. I was in Germany for almost all of COVID. My daughter at the time was 2, and I couldn't see my family, and I'm very close to them. And it felt odd and confusing. And so I wrote this book kind of dealing with those questions while also being why am I making an art show in a global pandemic? Also, we're at the law of large numbers. What's the meaning of all these things? And also continuing to ask, what do we call this? How do we talk about this, So in some ways, what happened was the show became the book, and then the book became the show, almost though you couldn't really figure out if the show was what you saw in actual space or what you read in the book. I love this confusion of like, is it the language or is it the thing where the work is? So the first iteration of the show was at Sculpture Center. The cows started to get bigger and more complex. This work is called, for example, Collect the Water Just to See It Pool There Above Your Head. Don't Be a Fucking Hero. The title is actually a reference to the 2018 Berlin Biennial, which is basically saying, like, we don't need a hero. We actually can sort this out ourselves. And I thought that that's a nice thing, especially in the States. Everybody wants to be a fucking hero. So I thought it was an important thing to start the show with. The work, of course, changes over time. So it started in March, and this is May. And then sometime after May, it looked like this. And then just in time for the end of the show, I kid you not, it was amazing. The sack that is the piece broke, and it just started dripping out the water. It was so crazy. And then at the end, we just buried it in the ground and called it a day, and now it's dirt again. This was the first time that I got to show a stained glass piece, and it was also the first time that I got to address questions that I had around fragility, and also questions that I had about, like, what is a time-based piece, and also what is a virtual piece. I was thinking a lot about the history of stained glass and its use in churches, and the fact that, like, there is just this wondrous thing about watching light move across colored glass, and it's always different because the light is always different, every day is different, and so I was like, oh, this is like literally light as performance, and it is a thing you can never pin down. It's never itself all the time. It's always moving into something else. So it made perfect sense for me to start working with. So this piece is called Floating Through the Canyon, Through the Canyon, Through the Canyon. The piece of martial law, the piece of martial law. The canyon walls are 2,000 feet high, 2,000 feet high, 2,000 feet high. Some rose-colored glasses, some rose-colored glasses. It is only a matter of time. No, this thing and not the other thing either. Creek, it's only a matter of time. Find me inside. Many of us were scared, but after they ate a pizza from the backpack of a man who was taking a swim, they were looking for dessert. They found the bag and decided to take it away. It's called Rose Brooks Leaded Stained Glass because I have a friend named Rose, and through the entire pandemic, everybody's like, oh, we were looking at things through rose-colored glasses, and I was like, what? And then I asked Rose, like, can you send me your skin in all of its different forms, and I'll amalgamate it into one color, and then make a glass that is rose-colored, like Rose, like my friend. And so the glass is the color of Rose's body, and then the blue lines that I used as the, like, kind of intervening lines are the ways that the New York City watershed comes in and then brings water to New York City. New York City has a disastrous water system, so much so that every time it rains, it is suggested by many architects to not drink the water because the water filtration systems are fully overloaded, and so you literally are drinking your, like, excrement at that point, so don't do it. And I thought, oh, these two different forms of fragility on top of Rose's body. There it is from the other side. I also started following words around in this show, which is something that I really like to do. And I kind of settled into the fact, like, okay, I'm trans, I must accept this. But I was thinking, like, what's up with this word trans? Because it's like, you know, when you drive on the highway, everything says, like, trans this or trans that. It's like transshipment. And I was kind of like, so am I also a truck bringing stuff around? And so I thought, let's look at different things that have the same name as me. And so, of course, since I'm from San Francisco, it made perfect sense for me to look at the Trans America building. I'm a trans American. It's like, duh, I have to work with this. And so I reduced the building down to its component parts, which is basically one pyramid going up and then one smaller pyramid that fits inside of it. The fabricators that I were working with, I asked them to approximate my skin tone based on Zoom. And so that's why it's that color. It's kind of like me through Zoom is the coloring of the piece. We used reclaimed redwood from the water towers of New York City. Those trees that they felled in the 50s to make those water towers were likely hundreds of years old. They're incredibly sturdy, absolutely beautiful, and kind of just being thrown away. The fabricators that I was working with were actively trying to rescue as many of them as they possibly could, and they let me have some. Oh, this is a long title. Should I? Let's skip it. Because it was during COVID times, everybody was looking at art online. We are always looking at art online, but I thought the German government gave me a little bit of cash, and I thought it might be interesting to remake my show in a virtual space. And so I had these young architects remake my show, and through the course of the show, until it went down, we showed this instead of the installation shots, because I wanted to be very clear, like, the show exists in real space. Yeah, this is the virtual. Yeah, this is like a handmade model. Wait, I think there it is. There's the model that they made. It's in Munich. Yeah. So the show had two parts, right? So we sent everything across the Atlantic, and as a Black American, sending something across the Atlantic is kind of a thing. It has a lot of charge and a lot of history to it. So the Trans-America Building made it, but we decided to put it on the canal to create a kind of remove. So there it is again. So you could never get too close to it, unlike at Sculpture Center where you could kind of mess around with it. And the piece in this show that sort of acknowledged this transit between New York and London was Coeville Proposition number 2, last year's Atlantic, or you look really good, you look like you pretended like nothing ever happened, or a weakening. And the piece is basically at the exact location where the show actually is, which is the midpoint between London and New York. At that midpoint is also something called the North Atlantic Cold Blob, which will be responsible for the slowing down of the Gulf Stream, which basically brings warm water and warm air up along the eastern seaboard of the United States and then over to the UK. That creates our weather system as we know it, and also does a lot of things inside of the ocean that we don't fully understand. So the slowing down of that will create, like, it'll wreak havoc on our food systems and our weather, and it's going to occur because as the Greenland ice sheet melts, it kind of creates this wall of cold water that the warm water can't pass. And I was like, that's where my show is. It's at this point of like deep change and intensity, also in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So I decided to make a piece that recreated the North Atlantic cold blob, or if you were to stay there for the entire year of 2020. So this is a 365-day long piece where you see what it would be like if you were at the cold blob for all of 2020. And of course you can't see this climate change, right? You can just see the ocean. So it looks like there's nothing happening, but a lot is happening. And so it was a second-for-second remake of the year. No, it wasn't on view for a year. It was only on view for like 2 or 3 months, and it was also on view at Sculpture Center for, I think, 5 months or something. So it didn't get its full due, as they say. But what's interesting about this piece is every time that it was Unreal Engine 4 at that time, every time that Unreal Engine pulls from all the weather data that we use to make the piece, it does something slightly different. It's like the computer can't remake the same weather twice, even with the same data. So if we were to show it again, even though it's the same year, it's never the same piece. So, yeah. Should I maybe?
I think we can
Yeah.
maybe just dive into some early. I think maybe I can ask a few questions,
Yeah, I
and
think
then
so,
we
yeah.
can get into what come to this project, because I think what you have demonstrated in 30 minutes, 36 minutes, is how you approach as an artist, how you approach making, how you approach creation in a way that it's always responding to where you are, your personal kind of experience in the world and your identity in this most flat-footed linguistic sense. So maybe I wanted to ask you a bit more about how did you find that approach? I know it's a big question, but like, was there a moment that make you realize, okay, this is how I have to involve myself, my identity, and my being in the way I work and centering that perspective? Because a lot of other artists, that they remove themselves from working, right? So but it's for you, yourself is very much at the center, and it is also very important starting point of how to think about your personhood in relationship being an artist. So maybe that's a very big question to start.
It's a huge question. There's a lot of different ways that my kind of comfort with letting the work kind of evolve arrived, I suppose. One of them, weirdly, is this like David Lynch books I read when I was like 16 called Catching the Big Fish, and it's basically just transcendental meditation for children. And the deal is that if you close your eyes and you calm yourself, you can find inside of you like a still body of water. And inside that water are all these fish, and one of those fish is your idea. And you just have to go there and find it. And sometimes there are fish that seem like they're the big fish, but they're not. And you just have to like let them pass by. And in the back of my mind sometimes, like when you're making work, I just think about the fish and wonder which one is the big one, and kind of sort of accept that the piece will come as it comes, you know? So there's that part of it. And then the other part of it, I think, is that I was really starting and being very clear that I wanted to be an artist in a time when identity politics were becoming like a very like big flashpoint in US culture in particular. There were lots of really intense things happening for young Black people, but also people were just self-defining in a different way. The internet was helping that happen, and that's cool. And for me, I kind of was like, how do I acknowledge and work with my identity at the same time as acknowledging the fact that like there are certain things that I love that are like art historically that are violent, inherently so. At the same time, they're also something that I'm interested in. And I kind of thought, well, if I look at myself and all the different ways that I am a person, there is both the hyper-specificity of myself, but also likely some universality inside of that, right? Because I am still a person, I am still alive, right? And we all are. And so I kind of thought if I could hone in on the things that make me myself, I might make work that would be interesting to other people because I am doing this hyper-reflexivity to a point where I can, where I reach a similarity or something.
I think it's also very interesting the way that you kind of use yourself, but not in a representational way, but rather just kind of removing all that kind of signifier, and then really asking, what is myself?
Exactly, which I don't know.
Exactly, and then I think that's also where I think your projects, I was debating whether it is process-based or whether it's time-based. Today, I think the answer is time-based. Yeah. Just because process is still, there is an end goal. But with time, every single day, every single presence is the end, right? So there is this kind of important thing that it's not reaching for an end. Even when a project presented in a museum such like ours, feel like every single day of the project, it is just in the present. And then we also talk about using an exhibition as a crit place, where it's almost like you never thought this is a finished exhibition. There are still, things can be changed, things can be updated, things can be fixed. And as the swimmer swims through, I also thought about this thing called swim or sink, where you actually have to constantly picking yourself up, right? Otherwise, you're just gone with the waves. And this is also kind of interesting. I mean, I find it's interesting in kind of thinking about this hyper-productive and capitalistic society that we're in, that we are forced to constantly swimming. And if one moment that we stop the stroke, we're sinking. And it somehow was very interesting to kind of thinking about how you approach your work. Like, especially with approach to failure, like allow that thinking to happen, even though we're artificially making you not think, but kind of to able to embrace that capability of understanding that failure is already embedded in every day. I think that's also a very interesting process in the work, even how you deal with the cows. I thought that was like really important to kind of thinking about. They're not meant to be pretty. They're not meant to be paintings in the capital P. They're not, you know, in a way that is they're dealing with our historical references and dealing with all these artists before you and after you. But at the same time, it is also just exist. So maybe that, I think that philosophical thinking as a poet and as an artist, I think that's quite charming, and also I find it's very unique in today's context. Maybe with that we can talk a bit more about the project that everyone is seeing above the second floor, which we can flip to the pages where the early conversations that started.
Hang on. Here we go.
We jumped a few.
Let's jump a few shows. Da, da, da. Sorry.
There's some really interesting projects which we should jump back
Wild
in the
shows.
future. But
yeah. Okay. Here we go. We're close now. Okay.
we're back. Okay.
Okay. Here.
I think we should start with them.
We can start here. with this.
Operation Crossroads.
Operation Crossroads. This is a very famous photograph of the celebration of the bombing of Bikini Atoll. This is a commander, I believe his last name is Monte, and he basically, obviously with his atom bomb cake, is celebrating having destroyed Bikini Atoll. There were people that lived on Bikini Atoll for a very long time. They were moved forcibly by the US government, and in the same breath, when the US government set off this atomic bomb, they poisoned some of the people that were nearby on other islands. They also poisoned other American troops. And so this photo is hyper sinister, in my opinion, because of course they're celebrating all of this death and destruction. It's such a crazy cake, hey? Yeah. Anyways, this is a very famous photo. Lots of artists have used it. It's all around. But I was looking at the Pacific because X had invited me to the show, and I was thinking, again, like, how am I going to get there? And it's like, well, I'm from San Francisco, so I would likely have to cross the Pacific. What's going on in the Pacific? A lot. And that kind of recognition of a lot is going on is kind of what fueled the show and how we were kind of thinking about it. I thought at first I would make a reality TV show or something that involved me building a boat and then sailing in that boat from San Francisco to Shanghai. I thought I would like get a crew together and we'd like have some banter, and it would be this kind of like wild conversation about those two things. In that process, I learned
And I was a fan of Below the Deck, yes. Which is a reality TV show in US that talks about how the people having crazy stories on the boat. So I was very inspired that maybe you would film a Below the Deck Pacific for us.
Yeah, and I was into it for a while there. We spent about a year just doing like feasibility studies. Like I realized, okay, I cannot build a boat. I don't have those skills. Whatever, fine, buy a boat. That's okay. And as time went on, it became more and more clear the dangerousness of pursuing a journey like this, even with the most experienced sailors, would be either so cost prohibitive or so dangerous that I could die. And I don't want to die. And so it made sense.
And we should not make the artist die for the exhibition.
It made sense to let that go. This map, by the way, is a series of, it sort of shows the different wind paths that you could take from San Francisco to get to even close to Shanghai.
And it's quite particular when you can go up and when you can go down. There's a certain season you can only go upwards, certain season you can only go downwards. It's not so easy as one think especially if you go with a sailboat,
Exactly.
not a cruise ship,
Yeah.
which is, of course, is a very destructive kind of vessel for the ocean lives.
Yeah. And I have asthma, so I can't be around like lots of gas for long periods of time. So as it became clear that we weren't going to sail, I started to look really hard at the map of the Pacific Ocean, and in particular at the topographical map. I'm very interested in maps and cartography and the way that, similar to language, maps can construct how you think that you understand a place or how you think you understand reality. And of course, the Western cartographic understanding of space is totally based on this bird's eye view control map headspace, and I thought that's a bit odd. So looking at this, I was wondering if there was a way that I might be able to abstract it and play around with it. And so this is how I got to the point where I was starting to look at the glass and making the glass. This is like one of the drawings that I made, like trying to create an abstraction from the topographical map, seeing what I could do with it. And then also thinking a lot about like what color is the ocean and what color would a mountain in the ocean be, and how many ways is the ocean, which is partially why that piece has so much color in it, because there is no color that is the ocean. Actually, it's many things, right? So yeah, then this was a proposal thinking about the idea of crossing virtually. Knowing that I could recreate anything with a computer and data, I thought, maybe I'll remake my crossing. But of course, when you think about making a crossing, you think about like, how will you get there? And because we were working in virtual space, I could let go of some practicalities. And I realized like, I, just my own body, could cross. And I could just swim. And so that's how the piece kind of evolved. It became very clear, like, this is just the most simple way to go. And so we created an avatar from photographs of my entire body, and we put the avatar into the ocean. We have some different APIs that are running, but basically what's happening is like the computer is pulling real-time weather data that's constantly being reported and is freely available, and then using also freely available past weather data. And the computer is basically saying like, I think, given this information, that the next second the weather will be like this, and then like this, and so on and so on. Which is kind of how the title comes into it, basically, which is like, it's a large language model that's doing all this prediction. And a large language model is basically designed to make a best synthetic answer. And best, of course, that just means the best. And synthetic, as in like, synthetic as in not real, right? But of course, you already start to get into shaky ground because it's like, this is a real thing. It's making this real thing that we can see. So I guess it's a synthetic answer, but maybe it's not. Yeah.
I think that was my question, is to kind of thinking about how your relationship with language and later on your relationship with representational technology. And I was interested in kind of wanted to hear more about how you think about your practicing relationship to people like Lawrence Weiner, who is a sculptor who uses language, right? And also that tradition of conceptualism. And as you mentioned, you're a fan of art history. Of course, I think that's people that you know, associate yourself with in their lineage, also being an American artist. So maybe you can share a bit more about how, I think maybe we can also read a little bit from the titles, because I do think that's a very important aspect of the other half of the work. To kind of thinking about, what the first question is, what's the relationship between language and representational technology in your work?
Yeah, it's a complicated one. Some parts of it are that language can do all of this stuff, right? It can make something possible inside of your head. So it's like a really fast way to arrive at a virtual space in your mind. And then at the same time, it also can make things impossible just by the way that you structurally think about things. For me, language's role in representational technology is really fascinating, right? Because it matters who writes the code for the thing, and then it also matters how you employ the data, in what way you use the data, why you're using it. And so all of these kind of underlying ethical questions are always kind of swimming around when I'm thinking about dealing with digital space, because all space has some politics inside of it. And so yeah, that kind of feels like a lot of what I'm up to, is figuring out like what are the things that we can't see, and since I can make us see anything, what should we see, and why, and what do I want to see? And also inherent in so much of my work is the fact that like I'll never fully be able to see it, right? It's like nobody's sitting in there for 7 months watching the piece. At the same time, the theoretical possibility of the site is also kind of fascinating.
I would be very curious now, after 2 years imagining the piece and making the piece, modeling the piece, writing the codes for the piece, how you feel after seeing it for 2 days of yourself swimming across the Pacific Ocean. And was it yeah, how does it feel when you're actually visualizing it?
Well, it feels crazy, I think, because in my head, I really practice very hard to not see the work, but to like only like create a cloud that the work could sit inside of. So it's like I didn't fully picture it. I just kind of had it. It's almost as though I didn't have my glasses on and I was trying to see the work or whatever, and now I have my glasses on because the work exists. Which feels really amazing and also quite scary, right? Because it is me, kind of. It's me in an outfit that I wouldn't wear all the time, like swimming pretty hard, especially right now when I can still kind of see the San Francisco skyline or the Farallones, depending on what's going on up there right now. And so it also feels quite surreal, like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of swimming a little bit. And it's also not so often that I'm wearing a bikini in public, so there's some kind of like, I don't know, like general, like usual nerves or stage fright or whatever of being like, oh God, really? That's what I look like? That kind of feeling, because my developers and I worked hard to make sure it really did look like me, and so it feels kind of funny to see yourself so closely, and then also to see yourself so closely with other people, just having to sit, you know?
But I think it's also interesting that you put so much of your family albums in the show, which is not something any artist I've ever met have ever done that. Like you are showing your entire life.
Yeah.
To an audience, which is quite different from your hometown audience, I would say. And that is hyper visibility in a sense that's also very different. It's different kind of real. This is a work on the third floor. How does that feel? Not just yours, your parents', your siblings, and your daughter's life in a public sense. I think that's also quite interesting. I mean, hold on to that thought, but I wanted to ask about other works in the show that it's not readily visible, or it takes time for people to notice. There's probably pieces that you have never noticed that it's in the show, like a mirror piece, like the piece on the 7th floor. I think there's one thing I always talked about in this show is that the base logic of the show or the making of your practice is very different. It was not for a spectator. It wasn't not like trying to disrespect the audience, but it wasn't existed because there is an audience. So is that true? Like, do you consider that work exists on its own, whether there is a spectator or not? And what is that relationship in your practice? The kind of people see it or not seeing it, perceive it or not perceive it?
I guess like it's kind of a double thing, right? Because the work is meant to be seen, the writing is meant to be read. It doesn't exist unless someone sees it. At the same time, it definitely still exists. And the crossing piece is a great example of that, but the mirror piece is also something that really deals with that, because it's like, we can't even put in the guidebook when it will be visible. Like, we don't know. We have no idea when it will show up.
It's based on the sun. So that's why you're not seeing it now, because there's no sun.
Yeah.
When the sun came, you will see the piece, but it's visible on the opposite of the building. Yeah.
Exactly, and basically we created like almost like a tree of mirrors that's up on the balcony right over there on the 6th floor, and as the sun moves, it catches the light and makes little squares on the other building, and unless you know what you're looking for, you have no idea it's there. But at the same time, the second you know it's there, you know to look for it. And you sort of find yourself kind of hunting around for it. I like this relationship of like, once you know, you can see something when you know to look for it.
Maybe I want to return the question to the Pacific, because as you mentioned, it's an obvious thing that you're swimming to Shanghai, because what connects the U.S. And China is the Pacific. And also I think, as a lot of people are talking about, that we're entering into a Pacific century, which is also a new way kind of reorienting, right? The previous century is the Atlantic century, which is the kind of the power dynamic between Europe and America. But now we're shifting it to the Pacific century, which is more the power dynamic between China and US. And being an American artist, and I think you use a lot of your Americanness in a very matter-of-fact way, and then using especially the US kind of colonial routes to determine where yourself representing America, even though you don't have to, but you decided to choose to do so, to swim across and to really kind of see or explore what has been done in the Pacific. I would be very curious to kind of think about your relationship with being Americanness, or this is how I think about. I think it's very interesting now to think about anyone's relationship with their nationality. So I would be very curious to kind of hear your thoughts about why you choose to kind of embody that Americanness in the way that you did for this project.
Yeah, I think being a Black American means that inherently you have a dubious relationship with being an American, because it wasn't exactly our choice to be Americans. It just kind of happened. At the same time, also to be a Black American who doesn't know so much about their history is also to kind of accept that there's likely some crazy rapes in there. There's some crazy possibilities about how my origins are. There's this running joke in my family. There's a white nose floating around. It's where's that white nose coming from? And it's because we don't know our history, we have no idea where it's from. At the same time, I always thought that was such a liberatory space. It meant that I was kind of free and unbound, but it did mean that I was American, and I had to kind of accept and deal with that. And also in the process of accepting and dealing with that, I have to say very loudly that some of the stuff that the United States has done is absolutely awful, and I don't like that I benefit from those things. At the same time, I must see them and acknowledge them, and so that's why the route follows that route, because it's everywhere where the United States has used their hubris to do something crazy. And I wanted at least to try to begin the process of seeing some of that, begin the conversation for my own self, a conversation that's being had by many scholars over many generations. Many people have been talking about this, and it's just kind of my step into it in a way. Yeah.
And then I also wanted to this is maybe more from my perspective. I was interested in the piece in a way that we're no longer looking at landscape, we're looking at seascape. And of course, seascape is not like landscape. There's not a lot of variation, but that's actually true. Let me correct myself. There is too much variation, but because there is too much variation, we can't really fix it. Become no variation, right? And the landscape, you could kind of find iconography of this mountain looks, is that particular Honolulu mountain or something. Yeah. And you can assign a signifier to it, so you know where that is. And but I do think understanding of waves and depths and kind of thinking about experience in the water is a very important new knowledge production site. And wonder, as you're modeling through this piece, as you're swimming in the ocean, what is it, the kind of the seascape that inspires you moving forward as an artist and as a poet and as a thinker?
I mean, I guess it's like the seascape for me is new, but it's not new for lots of artists and lots of people, right? Like for thousands of years, people have been thinking about themselves in relation to the ocean in lots of different places. But for me, it's kind of opened up this recognition that all this interest that I had previously in water was about these questions I had about unfixability, and then looking at myself in the seascape and kind of making a home for myself there, and sort of having these longer discussions with my wife of like, maybe we should be closer to the Pacific. Maybe this is a part of us. My wife is Australian. And kind of recognizing like, oh, like there is a lot of me that is of this ocean, which is a lot why I have those family photos in the show. Yeah. Something that's, I think, is really interesting about intimacy and the role that intimacy plays in this particular show is that there's 80 slides in the carousel. We change it once a month, so that's like 500 something slides. For some reason, that's just enough to feel as though you're close, but yet you have no idea. Like, you don't know what my dad sounds like. You don't know my mom is like kind of intense about getting the photo. You don't know that my sister is like absolutely silent until someone brings up a topic that she's really into, and then it's like you cannot get her to be quiet. You know, it's like these little things about a person you can't see in an image, but there's this odd sense of closeness that comes from looking at the slides. And I thought, that's worth adding or noting or something like this, because they are, as our memories change, they are so much of who we think we are or something.
I would say we're made of salt waters. And that is part of the ocean. So based on your logic and kind of the approach, I think you should make a lot more works about the ocean. Yeah. And maybe as a way of closing, I want to invite you to read some of the titles of the piece. Okay. Sure. Because for all the audience, the title is a really important part of Rindon's work because that's his poetry. And I think we could, if you have this book, and it's also a very important part of the exhibition, as it guides you through the show in a way that it will opens up your imaginations. And it also kind of connects you with different moments of intimacies, which I think is very important in experiencing the exhibition. So maybe we pick, which one do you want to pick?
I don't know, it's a good question. I wonder if we should do
Yeah. So we'll tell you the page number so that you can listen to the artist's reading while looking at the Chinese translation.
Let's see. Oh, this is a great one to end on. Let's do page 90.
第90页 page 90.
We realized that if we ran in one another's footprints, we could go faster. You go first, and the way we went, it was like this. You get out of the van, and you smile at me. Chubby cheeks and stubble, and you run. Long, red, brown dirt, a small fissure, always moving through it, where water has run and stopped and run again. You keep going, and the eucalyptus gets taller and stronger. Now I was first, and high off of that. My eyes always surprised when the hills open for the sea, and in this there is a muddle that's black in my mind now. And anyways, there were horses, and the horses, we'd pass them, and we'd always switch here, and I'd find your steps and your stride, just breathing, not talking. I can't stare at anything or I'd lose your footing, and if it was winter, it would be green, a wobbling, vibrant green, like a jogging toddler or the first movements of a fin. And then you keep going, and it's my turn again, and the grass gets higher, and the path narrower, and I can feel my arms pumping, and I move towards the burn in my legs. Why are you always lower somehow? You're getting lazy. You come in front of me, you slow me down, and it's all yellow and sage, and the dirt gives way to whatever sand is just before it is sand. And then you keep going, and the mountains keep growing, and you're cut right between a line amongst a bunch of curves, and if I didn't stop every time to watch you, I think you'd be dissatisfied. Then you start to go uphill one more time, leaving the floodplain and me, and that's it. You're there. You beat me. I lost your footsteps, and the ocean and the inland tide pools lay down at our feet like lazy cats, or our most beautiful friend, bored greeting. This would be the moment we'd race to the big rock to the right to touch it, even if the tide was high. I breathed so hard, and I could never catch you. Sometimes you'd turn and open your arms and throw me in the ocean, and then join me, realizing I'd either make you freeze or you'd never be able to catch me racing back to the van and the blankets and the hot water with lemon, which was so Spartan, but very you. And much later, we'd cross the mountain to Stinson to watch our friends surf or not do anything, but wind and wind our way to the lighter sand, the inlets, the whipping sand on our faces, and then once more back over the hill to watch the sun tuck itself away.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think we can open for some questions. 可以提问。有问题吗？ Okay. There's no questions. Great.
I have a question.
Okay.
May I know why you read poetry so fast? 我有一个问题，请问为什么艺术家读这个诗的速度这么快？
Why is this speed?
真的不要看。
Your reading was very fast.
I don't know. That's how it came out this time. Sometimes it comes out a little slower, but often it's got a speed. I guess.
Almost like impossible to catch a breath.
Yeah.
It's kind of one long stroke.
There's like no punctuation really, and the poem, this one in particular, is all about running. So much of my life and childhood was about running. I ran a lot. I messed up my knees, and my poems often reflect on that kind of rhythmic pumping and moving. So yeah, it's part of the work, I guess.
Yeah. All right, I see. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I do want to maybe ask one more post PS question as the video game aspect of this project, and also because I'm not a video game person, so I'm very ignorant in the video game aesthetics. But I will be curious in the kind of, because the larger piece you saw on the fourth floor is based on is modeled on this game engine called Unreal, and I'm be curious if I can see references of the piece in relationship to Western paintings, right? Like Turner, depicting of an ocean or depicting of a sea in relationship to the piece that we're looking at on the fourth floor. But I'm not sure if I have references of video game aesthetics to like referencing the piece, or this is something quite specific in that aesthetic discussion with AI, because there's also so much like AI generated imageries that look nothing like the one that we saw. So I will be very curious, just for you, someone that's very informed in this field, if you can tell us a bit more about how, when you're realizing the piece, what is the kind of the input that you like initially give to the collaborators that you had in terms of the kind of aesthetic decisions?
Well, yeah, there's like a few different games that we were looking at, but it's probably the most popular view in most games, which is the third person view, where you're kind of like just behind the character that you're playing's head. And that viewpoint is a completely unnatural one. You would never have that viewpoint, but for some reason it's something we favor. It kind of gives us this like, it's not God, it's something weirder. It's like an angel or a
It's like
demon's
your halo.
view. Yeah,
Your
it's like
halo view.
you are the halo or something, which is kind of wild, not to be confused with Halo the game, which actually does also use the third person. But there's some really intense third person games that I wanted to reference, like Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption. These games have had a lot to do with our psyche of how we think about dealing with other people's bodies and violence and things like that. And so I thought it was very important to use the third person view, but of course to tilt that third person view around all the time. So the viewpoints are kind of always crazy. That's why you end up sometimes looking at just my ear or like my thigh or underneath me. Like it's still the third person, but it's sort of messing around with what that means.
It's almost like we're the small fishes.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
the trash, that we're actually more the trash.
Yeah.
that
Oh my God, we
floats
didn't talk
around.
about the trash.
We didn't talk about the trash, but do you want to add an antidote about the trash?
Well, the trash is like, okay, I have a lot of questions about what is natural, right? So like we know now, of course, that the microplastics that are in the ocean have like gone into the water system, gone into the food web, and thus are now a part of us. And so I thought it was kind of this tongue-in-cheek thing to be like, oh, there's no living organisms inside of the piece, but there kind of are, because plastic is now becoming a part of us, and so it's something we ingest whether we like it or not. There is an API that was created that basically allows you to predict where trash will be based on the gyres and the movements of the ocean. So we plug that API into the piece and have plastic spawning and populating in the places where the plastic should be.
And of course, I'm sure there are algae in the rendering as well.
There has to be algae.
There are microorganisms that's not, depictable in a 3D model sense, I think.
We can't see it with our eyes, but what makes the color of the ocean at different times and different lights, et cetera, is the algae. So it's like we can only ever see it in aggregate, which I think is a fascinating thing.
That's why on the third floor of the museum there is a tank with algae where you can also see some of living organisms that makes up the ocean.
Yeah.
So great. Now we have questions. Oh, there's more questions. Okay.
Hi, I just have one question about the cloth leather. So when we are on the third or fourth floor, we're allowed to touch the leather painting. And I was just wondering if that's part of your exhibition, that after the audience touch it and it's gonna go aging, or there's gonna be some changes to it. And so how are you gonna take care of the leather painting? Is there something that you're gonna like put oil on it, or you just leave it there? Like, what's it gonna to be like, look like after 10 years? Do you have like an older painting that you can show us? Thank you.
Well, that piece where I didn't read the title, that's a painting that was like left outside for 5 years or something absurd like that. And the thing is, yeah, the round one, I don't know what it's gonna look like, but oh yeah, that's also some stuff that we buried that in the ground in the Netherlands and then put it in the church window. But to your question, I don't know what it's gonna look like in 10 years. I'm kind of interested. Like I would say minimal care of the cows generally. Like I kind of just let them do their thing. I think this is perverse, but I grew up in an art gallery and I thought that touching paintings was the coolest thing ever. And I realized, of course, like I made these paintings, I could decide what happens to them. And I don't see why you should be restricted in touching them when I know there's nothing someone's hand could do to hurt them. You know, they would just make the piece better if something happened to it. You know, it's a mark of its time here in Shanghai. So good, you know.
Thank you. That was
that's
my
a
mom's
good-
question. She doesn't speak English, but I also have a question for you, like from me.
But that was tell you 那个是很好的一个问题。对。
Just a technical question. How did you make the glass? Like, how did you paint the glass on the floor? Like the glass and the metal. Did you just pour the paint on it, or just use a brush to paint it?
No.
It's actually not painted. It's mouth blown. So it's like similar to the way that you would blow like a goblet or something like that. So all the color is blown into the glass, and it's actually reproduction Tiffany glass.
Like using a straw?
No, like a glass blower, 就是吹玻璃的那种吹法。 就是玻璃是它用不同的pigments，然后混到它那个里面去，然后你吹出来的，所以这个不是画的。对，it's blown glass.
Yeah. So like all the different colors are kind of pulled into the glass.
It's an old technique，就是蒂凡尼的。
It kind of remind me of a Chinese like poetry, like a pottery thing.
Pottery, yeah. It's a similar chemical reaction. Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is I just want to mention, we on the fifth floor of the museum, when it was sunny, you will be able to see something like this on the opposite of the building, 中石大楼, and it's sun cats that's casted on the other side of the building. I just want to show you something that you might come back in the future, you're able to catch in the gallery. Do you want to? Oh, we have more questions, right? Yes. Yeah. There was. Oh, you want to go first? Okay, please.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for this very impressive talk. And I'm wondering if there is any person who actually influenced you and your art a lot. It could be a poet or writer or artist, or just anyone maybe by your side, around you. Yeah, this is my question.
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of people that I'm looking at all the time, but one of the most important poets to my practice is someone named Lynn Hejanian, who passed away in February. Lynn's poetry is incredibly atmospheric and fascinating. She was kind of started this whole trend in poetry of thinking about like how do you create a space in someone's mind. So I really think about Lynn a lot. As far as like artists, there's tons and tons, but I think something that I do a lot is that I kind of play around with like ideas that I thought were kind of odd. So I'm thinking a lot about someone like Donald Judd because he drives me crazy, kind of makes me mad, and it's really helpful to be mad in the studio because he kind of gets you going and allows you to like push things around. And so another person like that is Robert Irwin, who is always talking about light and space and experience, but the works are so sanitized and boring, and I thought like that's absurd. I don't know. I honestly, your question has me thinking that I might make a list or something like that. So if you leave your email with someone here, I'll just give it to you. Yeah.
Okay. You want to ask?
Cool. Okay. I'm so grateful about also the previous question about the glass, and I'm ask about images. So glass is probably I think the only fabrication technique that I know of, like a major one, that creates from air and mouth an image. So I'm interested in this kind of non-optical image making, and this, I come from a very kind of culture, and I'm always thinking about how to make images that are constructed. You mentioned that you chose poetry because so this thing that cannot be gotten by taking an image, but by accumulating it. Can you talk about that? And also, I'm very interested, like, is there a way to actually treat the camera as a space versus like what it was before, like a room? Camera room. Oh, cool. Camera room, it's me, probably. Versus camera apparatus. So can you talk about this off space of image making that is not flat photography, and then how you bypass that and accumulate images, and how you came to that also, that moment? That's important, I think. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thanks. Maybe to summarize a little bit, it's a doozy. But I think I really don't I don't agree with the traditional hierarchies of art as they've been set forth. Like the canonical understanding of Western art is a bit whatever. And while as much as I come from that space, I also am like always interested in challenging it and playing around with it. And I guess that's why I got so interested in poetry and language as a pictorial space, because it was kind of this thing that it recognize the fact that every image that we see is completely subjective, how we see it and how we understand it and how we feel it and like how it comes into our bodies or whatever. And so I thought it would be nice to really acknowledge that by making the titles long and kind of letting you get lost in the linguistic space, so much so that you kind of maybe could forget where you began. I really wanted to acknowledge the virtuality inside of a person as a viewer. Like I needed that or
The
something.
virtual reality inside of a person. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. The virtual. Yeah, the
Yeah,
virtual
we
reality
can
of inside a
discuss.
person. But I wanted to bring back this previous. This might be not the first, but a very important earlier stained glass piece as well, which is taking on the composition of a very famous painting in history by Duchamp. What is it?
The nude descending a staircase.
Nude descending the staircase. I added a gender to the nude.
It's a lady.
It is. But I thought there was, but there was a debate that maybe it's not a lady.
Well, the argument is that maybe it's Duchamp playing
Oh, yeah.
his trans version of himself.
Okay, yeah, then maybe that's it. Yeah. So like how you like to take a tradition, like this is following the question about optical centered art history, like, but composition somehow is different. Like I like that you kind of flattened everything out and then kept some part of it, the composition part of it. And I like, it's almost like letting the rule stays, but replacing the meat. Like I'm interested in that because that strategy and that kind of that kind of approach seems to exist in a lot of other practices of yours as well. Like leaving something, like the previous work about the virtual reality where you're making a meat tree grow. Like it's also kind of coming from a similar like approach. So what is this kind of a rule setting approach that you're interested in? And in relationship to language, which is also rules.
Totally. I'm just realizing Irina's question just reminded me that poetry is also a mouth-based thing that creates an image too. So I guess maybe it's just a continuation of my interest in poetry, also this relationship with glass. Okay, now it's out of my brain.
That's interesting.
Okay. And then meanwhile, when you're in the studio, what happens to me in the studio sometimes is like there's always blocks or moments of confusion, and composition is by far the hardest thing to do in a piece. And because I don't think people should have such claim over their compositions, it's also a way to be an art historical referent. It's the fastest way to get over that block is to just steal someone's composition. And I mean, just to be honest, like that's what I do. I steal the composition when I need it. And I really needed a good composition for this. So Duchamp was a great choice because that guy can make a great composition. And it was part of actually his own psychosis was he was making all these compositions, but he couldn't put meaning into them. And so he was putting these like really silly meanings into the compositions. And so it's kind of like, ugh. Anyways, I stole this composition for the necessity to make a fireplace screen. Sometimes when I like think about my identity as like an American artist, I think a lot about the idea of like what is an American thing, and Tiffany glass is like this hyper American thing. It has all of this like intensive value, and so now it's reproduced. And what was so brilliant about Tiffany glass is that it has this both opalescent quality, but this ability to never be the color that it purports to be. So like this is actually supposed to be kind of like pinkish black, but it's like it's red like a fire. But then during the day it's dark like it's like been baking in the sun. It has you can't keep it stable, and it's like so clear, this instability. And of course I need unstable things for my practice. So I don't know. I think also this like matter-of-factness and ease of taking things is also kind of a way to like relieve some of the pressure that I kind of feel follows one into the studio as they make work, is this idea that like your work has to be incredible or something, and it's like if you take the bones of something else that has already been considered art, people's eyes automatically think that the thing that you've made is more artful, which is fascinating to me. Like,
But I like you use the word steal, which is great. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Maybe the audience first.
I have two questions. Thank you. Because there are many ways for you to choose the material, and why do you choose the specific media, like virtual reality, not just maybe digital installation, or just the PC games? And another question is that how do you think about the Chinese contemporary art, because of the relationship between China and the Western world is not so good, and for
to put it lightly.
yeah, include the art marketing. So how do you think about the future of Chinese contemporary art? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, the first question's a lot easier than the second, I gotta be honest. The first question, pretty straightforward. Virtual reality, what I was making for a little while there, these like little slide viewers where you could like look at a singular slide on this like box that was on the wall. And so I was showing these slide viewers all the time, and I didn't really understand what they were, and just like showing them wherever anybody would let me show art. And one time this guy came up to me and he was like, "Hey, have you looked at VR recently?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he was like, virtual reality, like, you heard about it when you were a kid. It's like, now it's kind of good. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was in, I think, like 2014. And it was kind of good. It was cool. And so I started like spending a lot of time on YouTube, like learning Blender and learning how to like make myself a virtual reality thing, just because I thought it was in such good conversation with the slide work that I was making. And then, of course, like the politics of it started to work its way in, where it was like a lot of white dudes in a room making this technology, and then they started talking about the idea that it was like an empathy machine, and I was like, no, it's not. Nothing is an empathy machine, right? And so that kind of made me be like, I guess I have to keep working in this space, because it's important to stick around in spaces where you're not so represented or whatever, to kind of make sure that at least there's one kind of person around thinking about those things. And of course, I wasn't the only person thinking about those things. I was just part of a minority of like young artists of color who was thinking about that. And so I kept working it into my practice because it felt timely and sensible, but then it also kind of doubled down on all my questions about virtual space. I don't know how to answer this question that you have about like what's next for the relationship between like Western art and Chinese art and the contemporary art scene. I mean, all I can say is that I have a lot of admiration for the contemporary art scene here in China, and I'm really into it, and I like just want to learn as much about it as I possibly can. I think that's my own headspace, which is kind of a bit of a golden retriever headspace, which is just like everybody's doing things that are really cool and I like it.
I think it will be important to just focus on the self instead of, you don't represent American artists in the way that you are an American, or you're an American artist, but you don't represent America in the way that it's like, I think it's important to not be trapped into these bigger categories and really just focus on individuals' practice. And I think this is also why we wanted to bring artists like Rindon Johnson's practice into Shanghai, is to finding different new connections rather than categorizing, okay, you're an American artist and you represent American modernism, or where we are here, you know, championing a very different kind of a charge. I think we have to find individual voices in this more larger context. I think be independent thinker is the key. And as an institution, that's what we want to champion as well. I think we can find very intimate connections between artists anywhere they come from. And even, I think for us, the larger Pacific right now is the focus. In addition to Rindon, we're also bringing a lot of other artists coming through the Pacific regions to Shanghai, where they will also find intimate connections to Shanghai and to other places in China as well. And that, I hope, is a beginning of finding more exchange in a way that it's not just like this kind of performance, but actually a deep interchange connection between different ways of thinking and being in the world. And I think artists, it's not just about the work you make, but it's also how you make the work and how you approach your life in relationship to your art practice. And that's what's most attracted to, for me, for your practice, and also many other artists I'm inviting to the space as well. I think they represent a different logic. And I think these kind of diversity attitude towards art making is what we need now. Yeah. Question?
Do we still have time? Sorry for starting.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, then.
Last one.
Okay, honored to ask the last question. I think when I first heard of the work title, The Best Synthetic Answer, and I had a question in my head, was what was the question? Because it's the best synthetic answer.
Right.
Yes, and I thought there must be a presumed question. But when I saw the work, then I realized, oh, it's the answer of the moment. It's the best computer-generated result. So it's the best calculating of the moment. So for the quality, the ever-evolving quality of the work, then now I see the work more of a happening piece than a video piece. And it's amazing it's a documentation of itself, because for actual happening piece, you need a documentation of the work. But for the work, it's the work/documentation. So I'm wondering, after the 7 months, when you reach Shanghai and you climb up the Shanghai harbor, and what's next? And how would you treat the work afterwards? Would you see more of a documentation or more of a work itself?
Well, there's a possibility I might keep going and turn around and go back to Germany. However, that's not set in stone yet, so I have no idea, to be honest, what will happen with the work. Truthfully, I don't know, and I don't mind not knowing what will happen once I arrive here in Shanghai. I think definitely I'll be here watching myself arrive, I can say that for sure. But I think also many other things will have happened in that time period of my swim that will likely make it much easier to answer what will happen next. But will the piece show again? I don't know. If it is shown again, would I turn back around and go back to San Francisco? I don't know. It's all, it's an open question. Let's see.
I think it's very interesting if you're really thinking about this virtual world as being real. And then it's not just a documentation, it's actually is a space, and how you want it, if you want to show it again next time in San Francisco, you have to make yourself swim back. And I think that logic really works, and I think it's a really interesting one. And I think in 100 years from today, when you show it again, or when other institutions show it again after they collected the piece, I think that will be, again, a very interesting kind of thing, just to thinking about, because we had a show earlier in the spring that looking at someone did this expedition in China in 1908, right? Kind of thinking about this impossible journeys that one think as this quest through this exploration. I think it'll be interesting to kind of thinking about maybe by 100 years from now, it's very easy. Maybe humans are so strong that everyone can swim across the Pacific. That might be like just adding time to your work. I think that is how I like to see it. Like see it from 200 years from now. What does that piece will think and sound like? And how will that capture the moment of now? I think that is a definition of a time-based practice. But I think we should answer your true question. There are questions that we asked, and this is the answer too. Maybe as the final reading, Rain, can you read the questions that you asked so that the best synthetic answers can answer?
Okay, so some of the questions that I asked, this is definitely an abridged list of the questions, was how does a Black American raised on the edge of the Pacific move through the ocean to reach Shanghai? Apart from obvious forms of resource extraction as forms of exploitation, on what levels am I also responsible for this destruction? As a consuming human on this earth, as an American citizen, as a Black person, as my parents' only son? What seismic shifts will come from the collapse of so many in concert ecosystems? Besides, ultimately, what does anyone gain from exploitation at this magnitude? How do I witness this ocean's past, present, and future? How do I attempt to atone for the United States' historical, current, and impending destruction and exploitation of the Pacific Ocean and the people who call it home? How to name all of that, how to swim through it. How big is the Pacific Ocean, really? Nothing is so big it cannot be measured, right?